Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
All right, let's dive deep today. We're going to untangle some connections between fluoride, the pineal gland, and even higher dimensions.
Sounds pretty out there.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. So
Right.
you sent over 3 sources for this deep dive.
Right.
We've got that YouTube video by Billy Carson, the one about decalcifying your pineal gland.
Yeah, I remember that one.
And there's that other YouTube video from Dr. Sam Byrne about color therapy and how it affects the pineal gland.
And then the NPR report on fluoride and IQ.
Yeah. So let's unpack all this, figure out where these sources agree and disagree, and, most importantly, what you can take away from it.
It's wild how these topics all kind of intertwine, right? Fluoride, IQ, pineal gland. They all center around optimizing our well-being. But each source has a different perspective on how to do that.
Totally. Since we're talking about perspectives, let's start with that NPR report on fluoride and IQ. Seems like a good place to start.
Makes sense. It's the most recent one.
It came out just this August, focusing on findings from the NIH.
The National Institutes of Health, right?
Yeah. Right. And the main takeaway is pretty surprising.
Surprising how?
Well, it says that higher levels of fluoride in drinking water are associated with lower IQ scores in children. Specifically, they're talking about twice the recommended limit.
I see.
And get this, the report estimates that something like 2 million people in the U.S. live in areas where the fluoride levels are that high. Naturally occurring, too.
Wow. 2 million people. So it's not like a tiny group we're talking about.
Exactly. It's a pretty big deal.
So what's the problem then?
Well, there are some big limitations to the report.
Okay. Like what?
For one, it doesn't say anything about whether lower levels of fluoride exposure, like what's found in most public water systems, is risky or not.
I see.
And it also says they need to do more research to really back up these findings.
Makes sense. So more research is needed.
Right. And that's where it gets really interesting because the experts have all sorts of different opinions on what to do with this information. Some experts, like Linda Birnbaum.
She used to head the National Toxicology Program, right?
Yeah, that's her. Well, she thinks that based on this report alone, pregnant women and caregivers should try to reduce their fluoride intake.
I can see why they'd say that, with the potential risks.
But then you have experts like Howard Pollack from the American Dental Association.
Right, the ADA.
And he's saying, hold on, we need more research before we jump to conclusions, especially because fluoride is so good at preventing cavities.
Yeah, that's the classic argument for fluoride.
It's a tough spot, right?
Yeah.
On one hand, you've got potential issues with cognitive development, and on the other, you have this public health measure that's been around forever to protect teeth. So what are your initial thoughts on all this?
Well, it really shows how important critical thinking is, especially when it comes to our health. This report is like one piece of the puzzle. We need to look at all the angles and potential biases before making big changes.
I agree. It's so easy to just go with the headlines or whatever the loudest voices are saying. We need to take a step back and really think things through. And speaking of potentially controversial topics, let's move on to the pineal gland. This is where it gets a little more mystical.
How so?
Well, Billy Carson, in his YouTube video, claims that fluoride is actually harming this tiny gland in our brains.
The pineal gland, right?
Yeah, and it's been linked to all sorts of things like the third eye and spiritual awareness and lots of different traditions. But first, let's talk about what it actually is, scientifically.
Okay, sure.
So it's this tiny little gland shaped like a pine cone. That's where the name pineal comes from. And it's deep inside the brain.
Interesting.
And its structure is pretty amazing. It's got these photoreceptors, just like the ones in our eyes. And it even has these tiny hairs that might act like antennas, picking up electromagnetic signals.
Really?
Yeah, and get this, it even have microscopic crystals in it. Wait, did you say crystals? Like actual crystals inside our brains.
Yeah, they're made of calcite. And we don't fully understand what they do yet, but some scientists think they help with biomineralization.
Biomineralization.
Basically, it's how living things create minerals. It's like how our bodies make bones and teeth.
That's fascinating. So maybe these crystals are somehow involved in that process.
Possibly. And some researchers think they might even affect how sensitive we are to electromagnetic fields.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah.
But let's get back to Billy Carson's video. He talks a lot about decalcifying the pineal gland.
Decalcifying.
Yeah, he believes it's key to unlocking the gland's full potential. And he says fluoride in our water is a major culprit in calcifying it.
Interesting. So what does that mean for us?
Well, according to this view, when the pineal gland is calcified, it can't function properly.
And what's supposed to happen when it is functioning properly?
Well, some people believe that it blocks our spiritual awareness and intuition, and some even believe it blocks our access to higher dimensions.
Higher dimensions, huh? That's a bit out there. But I'm curious about this decalcification thing. How does that supposedly work, and what methods are people using?
Well, people who believe in this stuff often say to avoid fluoride, do breathwork meditations that stimulate the gland, and even use color therapy, which is what Dr. Sam talks about in his video.
Hold on, you're saying color can affect this tiny gland in our brain. How does that even work?
It's interesting, actually. Dr. Bernie points out that a quarter of the optic nerve fibers in our eyes don't process visual information.
Really? What do they do then?
Well, they connect to other parts of the brain, like the
Yeah.
hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and, yep, the pineal gland.
Hmm.
He's basically saying that color, as a form of light, could influence these glands, although the exact way it works is still being researched.
So there might be more to color than meets the eye.
Exactly. But here's where we have to be careful about separating anecdotal claims from actual scientific evidence. There's some research out there suggesting that light exposure can affect the pineal gland's production of melatonin. Melatonin, the sleep hormone.
Right. But the research on color therapy specifically is pretty limited.
Okay, so maybe not jump to conclusions just yet. But before we move on, there's this experiment Carson mentions in his video that I found pretty interesting. He talks about how there's like a 7 to 8 second delay between something happening in the real world and us actually becoming aware of it.
Oh, I think I've heard of that.
Yeah. And then he claims that activating the pineal gland can reduce this delay, so we perceive information closer to real time. Is there any truth to that?
Well, that's a good example of where we need to be a bit skeptical. There is research into this delay in perception.
Yeah.
But the claims about the pineal gland manipulating it and giving us access to real-time information,
Yeah.
that's not really backed up by science.
So more of a theoretical possibility at this point.
Exactly. Plus, it's important to think about the motivations of the sources we're looking at.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, Carson's clearly promoting his own methods for pineal gland activation.
Right. He sells those supplements, doesn't he?
Exactly. So while that doesn't mean his claims are wrong, it's something to keep in mind. We have to think critically about everything.
You're so right. It's like we need our own mental decalcification to filter through all the noise and find what's actually true.
I love that analogy. It's a perfect way to describe what we're doing here.
So let's put on our mental filters and try to make sense of all this. We've got this NIH report linking high fluoride levels to lower IQs in kids.
Right.
And then we have these fascinating but scientifically shaky claims about decalcifying the pineal gland to boost our spiritual awareness and maybe even change our perception of time. Where do we even start connecting the dots?
If we zoom out a bit and look at the big picture, all three sources, even though they have different approaches and levels of scientific evidence, they're all talking about the same basic thing.
Which is?
The impact of substances on our well-being, both physically and mentally.
Yeah, that's true. The NPR report is all about fluoride, while the YouTube videos bring up fluoride and other things that supposedly calcify the pineal gland.
Right. And that's where the differences get interesting. We've got scientific evidence going head-to-head with anecdotal claims, traditional beliefs, and modern research. It's a total clash of perspectives.
It's a battle royale of ideas.
Exactly. So how do we make sense of it all without getting lost?
Yeah, that's the question.
I think we need to look closely at each source and find the bits that resonate with us while also remembering the limitations and potential biases of each perspective.
Okay, I'm game. Let's start with the NPR report. What stood out to you?
Well, the first thing is that the report itself is pretty cautious. They say they need to do more research to know how lower levels of fluoride affect us.
Like the levels in public water systems.
Right. And they also acknowledge that fluoride helps prevent cavities, which is a big plus.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also remember that the experts quoted in the report had totally different opinions on what the findings mean.
Some said to be careful and do more research, while others said to reduce fluoride intake now, especially for pregnant women and babies.
It's hard to know what to think, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even something as simple as drinking water can seem complicated now.
I know what you mean. It really comes down to personal choice and how much risk you're comfortable with. There's no right answer for everyone.
So what about the YouTube videos on the pineal gland? What stood out to you there?
Well, Carson's descriptions of the pineal gland and what it can supposedly do are really vivid and compelling.
I know, right?
He talks about the average person being like someone stuck in the ocean getting pummeled by waves of information, and someone with an activated pineal gland is like a surfer riding those waves effortlessly.
Yeah, I remember that. It's a powerful image. It makes you want to be that surfer, doesn't it?
Totally. And that's why these claims are so appealing, even if the science isn't really there. They play on our desire for something more.
It's like a modern myth, a story we tell ourselves to understand the world.
Exactly. And myths often have a grain of truth in them, even if they're not literally true. They can teach us things about ourselves and the world.
So we're not dismissing these claims entirely, but we're approaching them critically, recognizing that they might be more metaphorical than factual.
Right.
Now, what about Dr. Burns' video on color therapy? Anything interesting there?
What I liked about Dr. Bernier is that he presents color therapy as a gentle way to support the pineal gland. He doesn't make crazy claims about enlightenment or anything like that. He focuses on how color might affect our bodies and minds in subtle ways.
He talked about how different colors resonate with different energy centers in the body, right?
Hmm.
And how using color intentionally can balance those energies. It's a more subtle take on pineal gland activation.
Exactly. And even though the research on color therapy is still pretty new, there's growing interest in using it for things like mood, stress, and even pain management.
So once again, we're in this gray area where we don't have a lot of scientific proof, but there are lots of anecdotal claims.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean it's all bogus. It just means we need to be cautious and open-minded.
Okay, so if we're trying to connect the dots between all three sources, what are the main takeaways? What have we learned from looking at all these different perspectives?
I think the biggest thing is that we need to pay attention to how different substances affect our well-being, whether it's fluoride, environmental toxins, or even the information we consume.
That's a good point. And speaking of consuming information, we also need to be critical thinkers and evaluate our sources carefully.
Absolutely. We have to recognize potential biases and separate fact from fiction. It's about finding that balance between being open to new ideas and being skeptical.
So we've looked at each source in detail, explored their similarities and differences, and talked about the importance of critical thinking. Where do we go from here? What does all this mean for our listeners?
Well, I think the main thing is to be mindful of how stuff can affect us, like physically and mentally, whether it's fluoride, toxins in the environment, or even the information we take in.
That's a good point. And on that note of information, we need to remember to think critically.
Oh, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Evaluate the sources we're getting this stuff from. Understand their biases and separate the facts from the speculation.
Totally. It's about finding that balance, being open to new ideas, but also being skeptical.
So we've covered the specifics of each source, looked at where they agree and disagree, and talked about critical thinking. Where do we go from here? What does all this mean for our listeners?
I think the next step is figuring out what to do with this information, what actions to take, if any.
Okay, I like that. Let's break that down. What would taking action even look like in this case, especially with this mix of science and more mystical stuff?
Well, for fluoride, you could look into the levels in your water.
Right.
And maybe use a filter if you're concerned. You could also be more aware of how much fluoride is in your toothpaste and other products.
Makes sense. Being informed and making choices that you're comfortable with.
Exactly. And remember, it's not about getting rid of fluoride completely, especially since it's good for your teeth. It's about finding what works for you.
What about the pineal gland? What can people do based on what we've learned about decalcifying it?
I think it's about doing things that are good for your overall well-being, both physically and mentally. Exercise, healthy food, dealing with stress, and things like meditation can all help.
So a holistic approach.
Yeah, looking at the big picture and how your lifestyle choices affect your health and maybe even your spiritual well-being.
Right.
And be open-minded but also discerning with these practices. Not everything about the pineal gland and decalcification is necessarily true or effective. It's about trying things out, seeing what works for you, and adjusting as you go.
So it's about being proactive, informed, and taking charge of your health, whether we're talking about fluoride, the pineal gland, or anything else.
That's a great way to put it. You're in control, You have the power to make choices that fit with your values and goals and how you see the world.
It's funny how this deep dive into fluoride, the pineal gland, and higher dimensions has brought us back to ourselves.
Right.
We've explored the science, the myths, the debates, but ultimately it's up to each of us to figure out what to do with this information.
That's the beauty of knowledge. It's a tool, and how we use it is up to us.
So this has been a journey of self-discovery as much as anything.
I love that.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with a question to think about as you continue exploring this stuff on your own.
Okay, shoot.
What other things in your environment might be affecting your well-being? And how can you make good choices about your health when there's so much conflicting information out there? It's something to think about, research, and talk about with others. The journey of discovery never really ends. And remember, this deep dive was made just for you. So keep exploring these topics, dig deeper into what interests you, and come to your own conclusions. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep questioning everything.
If you enjoyed this episode of While We Were Distracted, be sure to watch the video that inspired it. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.